Well, everybody, we are back to our regularly scheduled program. A new Hell of a Boss episode is finally out. A lot has happened in the last 4 months. We are in a new year. We had not one but 2 Murder Drones episodes. I hit over 40,000 views on one of my videos, and I've uploaded a whole 3 videos in that time. Yikes. But now is not the time to belittle oneself, it's the time to rejoice. After all, Hell of a Boss is the series that grew my channel to what it is now, and I'm sure a lot of you have been waiting, so let's not waste any more time. The episode begins at the IMP office, and while Muna and Moxxie are antagonizing one another, Millie enters the room. I would say she is furious, but that would be an understatement. I have no idea how Moxxie's a married man and hasn't gotten a single argument that hasn't gotten him murdered. Apparently Millie had a run-in with one of her exes and isn't really handling it well. In the other room, Blitz is on the phone with a client who doesn't have a job for them to carry out on Earth and instead wants to meet them in person. The client sends a helicopter over to pick up Blitz, Moxxie, and Millie and then flies to the Ring of Greed. Blitz mentions that Greed is where Moxxie came from, and Moxxie confirms this, saying that he swore to never come back. As the helicopter flies closer to their destination, Moxxie begins to panic frantically, asking Blitz who they are meeting, and Blitz says he doesn't actually know. The helicopter lands and Moxxie is horrified to see that they are at his childhood home, with his dad waiting for him. Moxxie's father introduces himself as Crimson and is overjoyed to finally meet Blitz and Millie. Moxxie is very uncomfortable, and when Millie asks him why he never introduced her to his dad, Moxxie avoids answering. The entire group sits in the living room awkwardly, and Moxxie asks why they are there. Crimson says that he doesn't talk business before dinner, and that they are waiting for a final guest. Suddenly, a humanoid shark named Chaz brazenly and loudly enters the room. Both Moxxie and Millie recognize him and are just as shocked to see him as they are shocked that they both know who he is. Millie asks Moxxie why they know each other, and Moxxie begins to monologue. Moxxie used to be a part of the Mafia where he met Chaz, and there was an instant spark between them. They dated for a while, but were separated during a bank heist, and Chaz left Moxxie behind while he escaped. Once Moxxie was thrown in jail, he was heartbroken, but his cellmate was none other than Blitz, who cheered him up and devised a plan for them to break out. After that, Moxxie presumably joined IMP and never looked back. Millie goes into a blind rage and tries to attack Chaz, but is interrupted when the dinner is announced to be ready. The group eats at the dinner table, and Blitz finally makes Crimson get to the point of why they are there. Crimson admits he called IMP because he wanted to get to Moxxie because Chaz is having his induction ceremony into the family the next day, and Crimson wants Moxxie to release his shares in the family to Chaz. Moxxie asks why Chaz would ever be let into the family, and Chaz brings up that he has now a lot of money and has matured. Crimson tells everyone that they can spend the night and get some rest, and he has all their rooms prepared. Crimson asks Moxxie to stay behind for a talk, and Moxxie meekly obliges. Crimson calls Moxxie to come closer, and when he does, Crimson slaps him to the ground. Crimson is furious that Moxxie left the family behind and tells him that he's mistaken if he thinks that he can just leave the family. Crimson tells Moxxie that the real reason he brought Moxxie there is that Chaz can't be inducted into the family unless he gets married, and Crimson wants Moxxie to marry Chaz so that the family can get his money. Crimson threatens Moxxie not to cross him, and Moxxie has a flashback to his childhood. He remembers his mother always caring for him and trying her best not to let Crimson raise Moxxie to be a thug, which Crimson did not take kindly to. One day, Crimson brings a young Moxxie on a boat and makes Moxxie push a cement block with an imp's tail attached to it into the ocean. After Moxxie does this, he notices one of his mother's shoes floating in the water, and Crimson tells Moxxie that this is what happens to those that cross him. Back in the present, Moxxie is extremely intimidated by his father and submits. Moxxie retires to his room, which is separate from Millie's, and before he enters, Millie can see how perturbed he is and starts to question what happened. Moxxie avoids all her questions, assures her that everything is alright, and leaves for his room. Moxxie begins to think over his situation, but is interrupted by Chaz, who is in the room waiting for him. Chaz tries to seduce Moxxie with a song, but Moxxie is unstirred by his advances and kicks him out of his room. Chaz, left unsatisfied, goes to Millie's room to try to seduce her as well, with no success whatsoever, leaving his only available option being Blitz, who doesn't take much convincing. Moxxie continues to think over his situation and begins to cry as he looks through his photos of him and Millie. The more he cries, his grief slowly turns into anger and resolve, refusing to let this happen to him and, more importantly, Millie. Next door, after Chaz has fallen asleep, Blitz is suspicious of Chaz and rummages through his clothes to find his car keys. Blitz sneaks outside and investigates Chaz's car to find his eviction notices and bills, and a folded up piece of paper detailing Chaz's plan to pretend to be rich so he can be inducted into the family. Suddenly, Chaz appears behind Blitz and pushes him into the trunk of the car, locking him in. The following morning, Moxxie tells his father that he's not going through with the marriage, and threatens Crimson if he tries to hurt him or Millie. Crimson is unfazed by Moxxie's threats and has one of his guards tase Moxxie, incapacitating him. Millie is outside looking for Blitz and hears him from inside Chaz's car. She opens the trunk and 2 guards appear behind Millie and tries to grab her, but she's quick to notice and just as quickly kills both of them. In the backyard, the wedding ceremony has begun with Moxxie being bound and gagged, not able to do anything. Before the ceremony continues, Blitz and Millie drive Chaz's car through the fence and Crimson sends his mobsters to stop them. Blitz stays in the background as Millie goes on a Kingsman-style killing spree. Millie kills every single mobster and Crimson relinquishes Moxxie to her, not wanting to be her next victim. Before they leave, Blitz tells Crimson that Chaz doesn't actually have any money and was conning them the whole time. The crew returns to her office and Moxxie thanks and praises Millie, and she assures him he can tell her anything from here on out. The scene cuts to Crimson hanging Chaz's teeth on a plaque on his wall and angrily throws a dagger at a portrait of Moxxie, ending the episode. Helluva Boss has been on a downward spiral since Season 2 began, and since this is a web series, the fanbase sometimes has to wait months between episodes. Naturally, such a long wait creates pretty high expectations, and when the expectations aren't met like in the last 2 episodes, faith in the product dwindles very quickly. I am happy to say, however, even though Helluva Boss struck out twice, they are not out of the game yet and delivered an episode that may not be one of their best, but is a much appreciated improvement over the prior episodes. There's no debate that this is a Moxxie focused episode, so before we get to him, let's give the spotlight to the rest of the cast. Of all the episodes in the series, this episode is definitely the one where Blitz has the least amount of involvement. He still has a couple of quips throughout the episode and his signature aggressively quick to react style, but he ultimately plays little to no role in the episode besides being the one to expose Chaz for being a con artist. I think him having as little attention as possible was possibly the best route they could have taken with Blitz for this episode, since his personality easily dominates scenes he's in, making him a natural main character. But he still doesn't feel wasted, since he does contribute to the plot and asks enough questions to keep the momentum of the episode moving forward, be it giving Moxxie the opportunity to monologue about his origins or pushing Crimson to get to the point of why they are even there. All things considered, I think Blitz was handled very well, and I certainly wouldn't mind future episodes where he has the level of involvement he does have in this episode while still serving a fulfilling purpose. Millie once again gets the short end of the stick, with the episode showing 1 or 2 aspects of her character. Love struck with Moxxie, or an unreasonably violent murderer. That's it. At the beginning of the episode, there was a glimmer of hope when she mentioned that she had a run-in with an ex, giving a great opportunity to explore a little bit more of her past before she met Moxxie, which is something we desperately need, because outside of a few scenes in the series, everything we know about her is in relation to Moxxie. But of course that glimmer of hope is stomped out when her ex is of course intertwined with Moxxie's backstory, once again making another aspect of her character indirectly focused around Moxxie. We don't even get any insight into Millie and Chaz's time together. We don't know how they met, what Millie liked about him, or even why she hates him now. It's almost straight up disrespectful to her character that none of this is even lightly explored, since if she had never dated Chaz, nothing would be different. Instead of hating him for a bad relationship, she would hate him just as much for betraying Moxxie, so what was the point of having Chaz be her ex? There is an attempt to give a standout moment to Millie with the massacre at the end of the episode, but once again, she's doing it all for Moxxie. And it's not like her being an effective killer for Moxxie's sake is anything new, since we have seen her do the same thing in episode 3 and again in episode 6. So why should I be impressed or be in awe of Millie for this entire scene when I've already seen her do the same thing twice? I might go as far as to say, in the shallow attempts to give Millie attention, it all came off as more insulting to her character than trying to make her multifaceted or admirable. Chaz is the comedy relief of this episode, and it's pretty obvious that he's written to be dislikable and annoying, and that is exactly what he is. The writers nailed what they were going for, but I would have much rather had any character have more screen time rather than have to watch this character. Especially during the song sequence, which just felt more like a waste of time since it was supposed to come off as funny, but it only felt like it was crammed in to give Chaz a standout moment and to get an unnecessarily musical number forced into the episode. I would be exaggerating to say I hate this character, but just think all that screen time he had could have been used to flesh out Millie more as a character or do some more in-depth exploratory scenes of the Ring of Greed. Nearly anything would have been better. Crimson is the main antagonist and a somewhat serviceable one out of that. Most of the intrigue about this character is that he's Moxxie's father, which I think benefits this character as much as it hurts him. On the one hand, since he's the father figure of a main cast member, whenever he's on screen, the audience will pay attention, waiting to dissect anything he says or does that might tell us more about Moxxie's upbringing. On the other hand, though, just like Millie, he becomes an accessory to Moxxie, which keeps him from ever standing out as his own character, since he's not really all that interesting outside of being Moxxie's father. He's just kind of your typical mob boss with a typical accent, typical financial motivations, and a typical relation to Moxxie. There's nothing all that surprising about this character, and I don't find him that intimidating, which weakens him as a villain. He's not a bad character, however, and he fits the villain role well enough to get the job done. It would be disingenuous for me to say that I wasn't a little bit disturbed at the scene where he's on the boat with Moxxie and his master plan of forcing his son to get married so he can financially gain from it is pretty detestable. I can't say I look forward to this character's return, but he's not a lost cause. And now for the man of the hour, Moxxie. We really do get to see all aspects of Moxxie's character in this episode. His respect for authority figures, which we have seen before with Blitz, is accentuated when he's in the presence of Crimson, and when you're raised by someone like Crimson, it makes perfect sense as to why he's so formal and mannerly, especially when he's interacting with a figure of authority like Blitz. We see how much he loves Millie with some of the scenes in this episode, showing his love for her being the most heartfelt I think we have seen so far in the series, due to the situation being a serious one where his devotion to Millie is really tested between Chaz and Crimson. This all pays off wonderfully as we get to see Moxxie repeatedly stand his ground against Chaz, and the scene where he finally stands up to his father might be one of the best in the series. I did find it strange though that Moxxie and Chaz has this whole backstory where Moxxie was betrayed and Moxxie didn't bring it up once to Chaz and have a serious conversation about what happened that day. A scene like that wouldn't have been essential, but throughout the episode I kept expecting it to happen and it never did. Overall, we get some of the best treatment of Moxxie in the entire series. A new change of pace for how Blitz fits in the entirety of the episode to a positive effect, a villain who is undermined by the heavy focus on Moxxie, a new character who felt like an unneeded addition to the episode, and the complete patronization of Millie as a character. The humor in this episode is really lacking, which just like the previous two episodes, the narrative is supposed to be more serious as opposed to fun, so it makes sense that the humor might be this episode's weak point like the others. But there are some attempts at humor here and there that are startlingly bad. As I mentioned before, Chaz is the comedic character in this episode, and his entire shtick is being a shameless sex addict. Gee, that would almost be original, if that wasn't already done by another character since the inception of this series. And the other joke is that Crimson installed sex toys in his home because Moxxie is gay, which gives Moxxie the opportunity to correct him and say he's bisexual, which Crimson just shrugs off as being the same thing. I'll admit that I got an immature chuckle out of this the first time I saw it, but the joke itself just doesn't land well enough. It's a decent setup, but the punchline just doesn't feel right since this was supposed to stir a reaction out of Moxxie, and failed. If this happened and everyone else was still in the room and something like Chaz and Blitz started arguing over which one would feel the best while Millie gets flustered and Moxxie has to calm her down, whilst Crimson just watches all of them in disbelief of how stupid they are, might have been more entertaining. I usually don't like to write out how I would have handled a comedic scene since I'm not really renowned for my sense of humor, but Moxxie's muted reaction while we hear Blitz's reaction in one room over really made me want to see what was happening in that room instead. And if that wasn't enough, the writers had the audacity to reuse the joke later in the episode, which I appreciate them acknowledging something that happened earlier in the episode that most of the audience would have forgotten about by then. But again, what's the punchline here? Sex toys are funny? Isn't this show supposed to be made for adults? You know, sex jokes sprinkled throughout an adult series can be funny, but by this point in the series, they have gone way overboard, with them to the point where the only people who still find these jokes funny are people who are like Chaz in real life, which is a character who the writers specifically wrote out to be less intelligent, so make of that what you will. The only other jokes that stood out to me is Millie spanking Moxxie after rescuing him, which I shouldn't even have to explain why I was completely unfazed by that point, and Blitz assuming Moxxie has been trash-talking him and immediately becoming hostile, which is the only moment that I would consider to be funny. I would like to be less harsh towards this series for this style of humor, but it just feels like no effort is being put into writing a quick, witty, well-thought-out joke. And this is all coming from someone who laughed many times throughout watching Panty and Stalking, which is one of the most immature adult series I have ever seen. Maybe I just don't have a good sense of humor. Or I'm nitpicking, but there's something that felt really lazy about the humor since season 2 began, and if you feel the same way, let me know so I know I'm not just being delusional. Backstory episodes like this are supposed to strengthen the viewer's connection to a character, and I gotta say that I almost respected Moxxie as a character more. Remember when I said the scene where Moxxie stands up to his father is one of the best in the series? Well, it would have been, but then this happens.
I'm leaving, Dad. And if you or Herpes the Clown over here try to stop me, you'll learn firsthand just how good I've gotten at my job.
Moxxie is submissive and fearful of his father throughout the entire episode. So when Moxxie stands up to Crimson, that was the moment that every single one of those scenes was building up to. This moment was supposed to showcase growth, confronting one's fears, not letting the past control you, and fighting for what you believe in. And the payoff? Moxxie gets tased and incapacitated before he even has a chance to fight back. Who wrote this? Who thought this was a good idea? It is incomprehensible to me that someone wrote an episode where Moxxie is being belittled and beaten down the entire episode and finally gets his moment of redemption, all for it to be kicked out from under him. And for what? To subvert expectations? Throughout this entire series, Moxxie has been advertised as a gun expert and is a hitman for a living, yet we never really get to see him show off any of these talents in a way that is impressive. I thought this was going to be his moment, to show how skilled he really is and to fight his way out of the house, killing dozens of Crimson's henchmen along the way to get Millie. Just imagine that. Imagine us getting a John Wick style shootout with Moxxie inside of the house. That not only shows how competent he is with guns, but also shows his father that he's not the pushover he used to be. But instead, we get the Millie massacre scene, and I'm pretty sure I'm one of the only people who wasn't impressed by it. It's fun getting a killing montage, and it gets pretty creative with Millie's kills, but there is no sense of complexity or effort because no one seems to actually present a challenge that tests her skills in a way to make her victory feel earned. At this point, you're probably thinking I hate this episode, but besides those two scenes, the humor and the treatment of Millie, I don't think the episode is that bad. It is an improvement over the rest of Season 2, and thankfully distances itself away from having anything to do with Stolas. I think that Moxxie does deserve his own episode, and we did get to see how dedicated he is to Millie, and he still did stand up to Crimson, even though it didn't amount to anything. Also, we get to see how Moxxie and Blitz met, which is something I have been wondering about since the series started. And even more importantly, we get a scene where we just get to see what the Ring of Greed is like, which is the first time we ever get to see any actual world building in the series. There's also the added bonus of the show subtly referencing old episodes with the Moxxie being fat and damaged wall jokes returning, and a condemned Lululand briefly being seen. So there are moments here that feel really rewarding for viewers who have stuck around this long. And I like to think the writers are learning from their past mistakes and are listening to criticism from the fanbase. Despite everything, as long as they keep on listening to the fan feedback and never write a scene that undermines the entire build-up of the episode ever again, the future is looking promising for Hell of a Boss, and I'm pretty confident the next episode is going to be a memorable one.
What is that? What is that? Wait,